Good afternoon. Just very quickly, because I won't have time to do it later, I just wanted to thank the local people who convened this and organized this. Sang Kwan, Ken Stuart from our communications department, Melanie Park, Paige Johnston, Travis. They did a lot of work putting this together, and it's a kind of amazing collection of people whom I also want to thank. Most of you know, I mean, there's a massive intellectual force at work here, and to have it focused on a single body of work is very, very exciting. You may not know, we have a lot of important people with direct connections to the Office of Ieoh Pei, as was discussed last night and again this morning. But we have as many people whose connection to Pei is only intellectual. I take it most of you have not even met him. So that is also something to ponder and think about and appreciate. And of course, there's Hong Kong to come, and thanks to Eric, Chien, and Cole Roscom, and others for helping organize this in relation to Harvard. Today, this session, which is the first of two for the afternoon, is entitled Spatial and Formal Practices. But I just want to quickly say, perhaps suggest other things to listen for as we go across the papers, because then we'll have time for discussion across the papers. Listen for issues of movement. This came up last night. You're going to hear it again a bit today. The issue of movement begins in Pei's thesis project, and I'd like to sort of talk about how it compares maybe across some of the other projects. Related to that is relation to site. You'll see one absolutely amazing, let's say, topography, the Mesa project, and how that differs for the urban projects, which we've mostly been talking about. Patronage. You'll hear an intense involvement by one patron, also for the Mesa project. But I'd like to think about, not everyone will talk about it, but see if you can register. I mean, how does a museum director or a museum donor, do those marks show up in any different way than some other patrons? And finally, there'll be some strong claims toward the end of today, into the presentations, about registrations of time as well as movement. And that's something that hasn't come up. Most of the people who talk about the materials and the spaces and forms are either talking about them experientially, but not, let's say, philosophically, which we will also hear. Our first speaker is Daniel Abramson. Danny is a friend of the school. He's professor of architectural history at Boston University, where he's also the director of the architecture studies program. Just in his beginning of his second year, having come from Tufts. Danny is an alum not of GSD, but of the History of Art and Architecture PhD program, and he's been very, very close to the GSD since he left there, and we welcome him.
Okay. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction and also for framing up this session. I am grateful to this conference organizers. They accepted a paper on a topic that's hardly mentioned in the Pei literature. Government Center is obscure in its history and design, seemingly marginal to Pei's career, and so may trouble or vex historians. What was Pei's responsibility here? What does it mean? And what, in general, should we do with the evidence of minor works like this in narrating a career? Government Center is vexing in other more public ways, too. For generations, it has seemed to be one of Boston's civic calamities. The broad paved City Hall Plaza at the plan's heart, in particular, is derided as cold and empty, without focus or incident, commonly characterized as a barren wasteland. Government Center vexes countless visitors as lacking in form, absent of meaning, and resistant to appropriate use. To better understand vexing Government Center's vexatiousness within Pei's career in Boston, I propose looking at the evidence of planning studies produced before Pei's involvement, to compare these to each other, and then to the Pei office's plan. Since the mid-20th century, Boston's leaders had considered redeveloping the portion of the city north of the central business district and east of the State House. So just to be oriented, there's the State House. Now nestled in the 1950s in the crook of the new elevated highway, the Central Artery, and centered on the curve of Scully Square, right here. The specific goals of the government center redevelopment were: 1, to replace this rundown commercial district with new private sector development, primarily to improve the city's tax base. 2, to rationalize the warren of streets for better vehicular circulation and to produce larger development sites. And 3, to consolidate various dispersed government offices, which were part of the expanding American welfare state, at city, state, and federal levels, which would itself also help to prime the area for private development. In design, city planners in 1956 sketched a new arrangement running east-west. So now, from now on with the slides, the vertical axis is going to be the east-west, with the State House up here to the west, and down here the east towards the harbor. Sketched a new arrangement running east-west between the State House at the top of the plan and the retained colonial-era landmark of Faneuil Hall here. You can line that up in the slide on the right. There's Faneuil Hall. At the bottom, note that in the plan on the left, 19th century Quincy Market, below Faneuil Hall, is completely obliterated. Linked in part, this east-west axis, by this broad new street that subdivided the area to the south with private development next to the existing business district, and to the north with new government buildings. The State House offices were positioned westward, appropriately alongside the State House. The largest federal building, projected at 1 million square feet on the biggest block down here, at the angle facing Faneuil Hall, and a new City Hall in the center position. A year later, a new 1957 set of plans now relocated the federal building to the center, with City Hall shifted to the angle across from Faneuil Hall. The main east-west axis, significantly, is now a series of open pedestrian plazas, not a street. The earlier plan's vehicular primacy is thus mitigated, its wanton disregard for the past too. Note that Quincy Market is now retained. Yet there are tensions within these 1957 revisions, as illustrated in this eastward-facing perspective towards Faneuil Hall, standing in the Federal Buildings Plaza. So this view is taken roughly from this position, looking down this way, eastward. The street system's primacy in the plan's objectives is suppressed in the image on the right by an idealization of the pedestrian plaza's seeming continuity over the street. Moreover, the irregularity of City Hall's off-kilter angle to the federal building in Faneuil Hall, and now there's a detail in the plan on the left that lines you up with that perspective view, so that's what I mean, that off-kilter relationship. That off-kilter relationship is concealed in the perspective view by an imagined geometric, whoops, let me go back on that. It's concealed by this imagined geometric right angle. Pedestrian life here is shown happily ordered within modern regularity, symbolically framing an historic landmark. This, on the right, is a dream of form and meaning, not their actual difficult realities. A year later, in 1958, a new plan retains the federal building still on the central site, now including a much bigger plaza. Crucially, the federal building is cranked northward to align not with the proposed new east-west axis, but rather with the existing angled street pattern. The building is pushed northward by the kept curve of Cornhill, and it now runs parallel with existing Hanover Street, both of which had been absent from the 1957 plan. The design is literally bending to what exists. In fact, for the first time, the 1958 planning document openly acknowledges the value of the past. Not only are Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market retained, but so too are a block of colonial-era structures and alleys along Blackstone Street. And Scully Square regains its name at the curve between Cambridge and Tremont Streets. Indeed, this 1958 planning study can be seen as the revenge of Scully Square, even before its actual demolition. Its curve is now allowed to break rather than be subsumed within the new east-west axis. It splits the earlier unified plans in two at the angle of the Federal Building, dividing the scheme into separate western and eastern halves, eroding its overall coherence. The most complete planning study for Government Center, a 33-page illustrated booklet, appeared in the following year, 1959, produced by the outside planning firm of Adams, Howard, and Greeley, headed by the MIT planner Frederick J. Adams, and using as consultants the MIT affiliates Kevin Lynch and John Meyer. In the 1959 Adams, Howard, and Greeley plan, Government Center is now fully splayed open. Whoopsie daisy. Fully splayed open. Fully splayed open along that north-south axis. Let me go back. The largest federal building is now relocated southward. Here, close to other federal offices in the business district, and the smaller city hall is now placed in the center, right there. A 6-story rectangular-ish block around a central courtyard, and we see that there's City Hall right here. City Hall, the planners declared, must be the principal building since it contains the local seat of government, they wrote. The east-west axis is now completely given over to a zigzagging chain of public spaces, coming down here, breaking through here, splitting over and down like that, forming the spine of what the planners denoted, quote, a valley of low buildings, to conserve views of prominent landmarks from Faneuil Hall to the State House dome at the top of this view. The symbolic and the visual have become the dominant priorities explicitly now in the planning document over the original economic and traffic aims, so that this new plan could produce a seemingly harmonious, quote, contrast of old and new. In fact, the tensions in the plan are now pulling it apart, not producing a happy harmony, most clearly in its center. City Hall's bizarre splayed shape is a function of the discordant angles of Old Hanover Street and Scully Square, and the new pedestrian steps to the eastward. Similarly, the new Civic Square, as it's called, is splayed open to fill the space between the curve and City Hall, lacking strong geometric form or focus of its own. In perspective views, the Civic Square is formless, without orderly containment, landmarks, or foci, a place of informal traversing views and perambulations. It is, I think, an odd vision of the Civic. Indeed, the planners had little sense at all of what would take place in the Civic Square beyond walking and congregating and vague what they called civic ceremonials. they evinced no understanding of the actual political structures that produced and were accommodated at Government Center. Indeed, the post-war American welfare state created growth at the federal and state levels where its funding and administration took place, which is why the federal and state, not city buildings, were always the largest in square footage in the Government Center program. Thus, featuring City Hall, as this plan does in 1959, even for purposes of creating local goodwill, featuring City Hall in the center, nevertheless misrepresents realities. The 1959 plan, with its featured City Hall, represents a sentimentality, knowing or not, for a pre-welfare state polity, before federal Washington, in partnership with the states, ascended above the local. We arrive now at the Pei plan on the right. The firm was hired in 1960 by the incoming director of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, Ed Logue, who, as Harry Cobb has explained, Logue wanted a rising star architect with a big enough office staff to implement the scheme. Logue, as you know, was also very fond of concrete. The Pei office also had significant experience already in New York, Washington, and Philadelphia with the developer William Zeckendorf, doing similar public-private, large-scale, federal-funded urban renewal projects. The Pei Office 1961 plan, authored by Cobb with the assistance of August Nakagawa and general oversight of Pei, kept the 1959 scheme's dominant north-south arc, however, shifting the state buildings now to a new campus northward, and the federal building from the south to the site now north of City Hall. City Hall itself remains in guideline, a rectilinear central courtyard building, but now regularized into a square and slightly rotated and shifted southward so that it stands, as Cobb has explained, deliberately more isolated and monumentalized from the buildings around it. The southward shift of City Hall also turned the earlier oblong Civic Square into a more L-shaped space, lined to the west and east across major traffic arteries by a pair of curved blocks, and to the south by the arc of the now retained older 19th century Sears block. The Pei office also notably grassed most of the open areas. We can see the thin paths across the stippling, including the central plaza, now denoted Government Center Common. This was close to the nearly realized plan, though when Kalman and McKinnell won the competition to design City Hall, they produced a more rectangular structure and insisted that the plaza be paved, not grassed. To the north, the Massachusetts State Service Center complex of buildings was reorganized into a single integrated mass by Paul Rudolph at the suggestion of the Boston Redevelopment Authority. What then did the Pei office contribute to this serial design of Government Center? In effect, very little. The earliest schemes adumbrated the street layouts and pedestrian routes, the dominant arc and historical sensitivities, plus the prominence and shape of City Hall. The Pei office's primary contributions were to increase the isolated, perhaps we might say sentimental, monumentality of City Hall and to expand the Central Plaza. Soon after, Government Center, and particularly City Hall Plaza's formlessness, was felt to be deficient. A deliberate antidote, Rudolph's State Service Center, again in the upper right here, in its original conception, formed a more coherent, unified whole than the separate buildings around City Hall Plaza. The Pei Office's own Christian Science Center, from just a few years later, offered a better balanced equilibrium of solids and voids than did City Hall Plaza. The Christian Science Center's public spaces have always been considered a great success. City Hall Plaza itself has been renovated several times. It lost its fountain, which had been located here, and gained a street-side arcade by Chan Krieger, and has been subject to numerous proposals to fill in, shape, and give life to the apparent wasteland. Over the years, it has also regularly hosted numerous events, from circuses and skating rinks to music festivals, and even as we speak right now, a temporary setup of geodesic domes for Boston Hub Week. In effect, City Hall Plaza has come to function less like a civic piazza and more like a small-town fairground. Empty space awaiting activation and then lapsing back into disuse. Perhaps rather than being vexed by this seeming wasteland, we should come to accept City Hall Plaza, name it for what it is and what it does well, to be simply Boston's fairground, a site of ad hoc invention in its formlessness. Indeed, formlessness reflects Government Center's history and making too, not solely authored by Pei, his firm, or any other singular entity. Government Center's design is rather the product of a more or less haphazard relay, handed on from one team to another from 1956 to the present, seemingly without end. How can such a relayed design be fit into the narrative of a single architectural firm, much less one person's career? Harry Cobb sees Government Center as crucial to the office's future patronage, especially in Boston. Yet this significance too is in the form of a relay, meaning deferred to later. Indeed, in its spatial formlessness and relayed design, Government Center seems to resist placement in any overarching interpretation of Pei's work. And so it illuminates the artificiality generally of totalizing narratives of a life or of a career, which may not easily digest minor evidence like Government Center. Its obduracy, its difficulties, can perhaps be seen positively from both historiographic and design perspectives. Like its fairground character, a formless void, it is true, Government Center is also a site of possibility and invention by future historians and designers alike. In conclusion, Government Center, a wasteland indeed, for worse and for better. Let it continue to vex us and allow us to vex it, to question, probe, and intervene in its troublesome and vexing form and history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. Stuart Leslie teaches the history of science and technology at the Johns Hopkins University. But he's written much on architecture, including studies of Saarinen's corporate laboratories, the healthcare work of Goldberg and Zeidler, as well as laboratories by Louis Kahn, Edward Durrell Stone, and what we'll hear today, a lab by Ieoh Ming Pei, the NCAR Mesa lab. Yes, Stuart.
Okay. Well, I study the scientists and engineers and physicians who live in the buildings you design. And so I tend to tell it from their side, and they often complain, so you have to forgive that. Now, laboratories, of course, measure their results by Nobel Prizes, not by Pritzker Prizes. And some of the most renowned laboratories in Nobel respects, like Murray Hill, Bell Labs here, are some of its least distinguished architecturally, and something like Frank Lloyd Wright's Johnson Wax Tower is one of the worst research spaces. It looks great, but you can't put anything in it, and they became eventually so unhappy that they left it altogether and just abandoned it. You just can't put any instruments under there. Wright was about my height, and he thought anything higher than that was a waste of space, but not for a gas chromatograph. So Ieoh Pei's Mesa lab, shown here, is one of those few labs that is as renowned for its architecture as it is for its scientific contributions. And I think that's because it was such an active collaboration between a visionary architect and a visionary scientist, both young men at the time in their 40s, both looking to establish their reputations, and really a back and forth between them. It may be, to many of you, one of his less familiar commissions, but it will be certainly familiar to all of you for Woody Allen's Sleeper, which was filmed here in 1973, and there he is. He actually is about 5 feet off the ground, and he was never higher than that. But what I like about this, and I couldn't resist showing you, is it perfectly captures the two aspects of this place that are most important. Its architecture and its computers.
You love her now?
Oh, Miles. I don't know.
Right. The coast is clear. Stop lowering me.
This is manual.
No, that's fast forward.
That's all I have clearance for. You have to go rent the movie after that. But for Walt Roberts, the idea of Mesa Lab was that it would be a kind of village green in this network of institutions that NCAR is. The National Center for Atmospheric Research is not just a single building, but a series of places that contribute data to this place, which then turns it into computer models where it's analyzed and observed. And Roberts had some very strong convictions about the sort of place that he really wanted. He wanted a place that would be characterized by complexity, by communication, and by creativity. As he liked to say, there are 20 ways to get from my office to the chemistry department. And for what that meant for him was 20 different ways of serendipitous encounters, chances for people who might not otherwise see each other to do so. His idea was something that would be small enough so that everyone would know one another and he would know all of them, but large enough to get on with the job at hand. This is a nice aerial view of it. It sits, as you'll see, on this Table Mesa in front of the Flatiron Range, which is this spectacular set of mountains in the foothills of the Rockies in Boulder, Colorado. He firmly believed that small was beautiful, but he also believed, this is Fermilab, designed actually as much by Robert Wilson, its founding director, as its architect. I think it was Moshe Safdie said, you know, scientist who serves as his own architect has a fool for a client. But what he wanted here was something that would be recognizable, something that would be beautiful, and something that would be a good place to work. It's none of those things, but Mesa Lab is all of those things. This is Walt Roberts on the left, Ieoh Pei on the right, at the dedication of the building about 50 years ago. And what he told Pei he wanted was not only a stunning, visually stunning laboratory, but a place that looked like a creative space. One that would look like something that a place scientists would want to work, but the public would want to come. He thought that it should complement rather than compete with the site, and there's very good reasons for that. And a place that would be small in character, although it would have a staff of 350 people. This is a building Roberts designed himself. And what he liked about it was small. He noticed that people would meet each other in the hallways, that communication just doesn't work very well up and down. And he wanted to capture that spirit as he moved from this laboratory on the campus of the university to his new one. But he really didn't know much about architecture, so he had to find somebody who did. He knew what space he wanted to use. His house was within sight of this mesa, so he knew exactly where to put it. He just didn't have the architect who could design the right kind of building, so he set out to find him or her. He turned to Titian Papachristou, who was in Breuer's office later. He's the third from the right. And he quite understandably said, go out and find me good models for Mesa Labs. See if you can find good models and good architects who can do the job for me. He said he wanted dispersed buildings. He didn't want anything monumental. He wanted restraint and simplicity. He wanted a sort of Spartan character. So he and one of Roberts' assistants went out to see what was there. And what they discovered was nothing that they liked, although they should have liked this one. This is General Atomic by William Pereira in San Diego. And it's a classic sort of aerospace modernist building, or you might call it Country Club Californian in design. But it stands on these little blue spider legs like something ready to take off into the future. But none of these laboratories seem to have the soul that he was looking for. They compiled a list of architects, actually, and the list is interesting, and what they had to say about the different ones is interesting, too. So Saarinen was on the list, and they made a little note, we'll design a unique building, but it'll be impossible to live with. And Yamasaki was on there. We'll design jewel box building, but it'll cost too much. And they went through all the list of architects, and they couldn't really find one that was going to give this the attention that he thought it deserved. Finally, they decided, well, if we can't find an architect on our own, we'll go and we'll ask the deans of the top architecture schools, who are themselves members supporting this laboratory, to each nominate a candidate. Now, I'm not sure that I would want the deans of architecture to do the actual site work on this, but there they are. And of course, each of them nominated one of their best alums. MIT nominated Ieoh Pei, and gave him the idea that he should build a kind of monastic place of dense interchange, a lot of collaboration, and interdisciplinary research. The idea was not a monument or a temple, but as Roberts put it, a place where people can be distracted by a different kind of beauty, one suitable to the site, but also to the requirements of the scientists who would work there. So he was brought out, as were several others. In his favor, I guess in his favor, was that he'd done this building at MIT, which is an earth sciences building. He'd also worked in Denver, as you saw. He knew a lot about concrete, which was important because that's what Roberts thought the building should be made of. And he obviously made it a priority. He told Roberts that he was going to give himself heart and soul to this. He said, Roberts asked him, what kind of, you ask 10 scientists what sort of building you want, and you get 6 different answers. And Pei told him, give me a chance, and I'll give you a 7th answer. And that's exactly what he ended up doing. This is just to give you a sense of the site and the scale. Pei's first building was more like that building at MIT. It was about 10 stories. It was monolithic. It would have been utterly dwarfed by the site itself. It would have disappeared. The scientists who saw those plans said, no, we insist on something that isn't a monolith. We want you to break up this piece. We've got 350 people here, but we don't want to be in a tall tower. They also gave him instructions like, I want to be able to hear the birds sing, and I want to be able to open the windows, and all those kinds of things, which were not going to be possible with that design. They also sent him a very revealing note. They said, you might think about the winters here. They're really cold, and the wind blows very hard. So spend some time out here in the winters, which he never did. He was only there in the summers, and he talked about how wonderful it was to walk the Mesa and see it in the summertime. But of course, when you get up in those crow's nests in the winter, it's a whole different kind of experience. So NCAR had its architect. He had his instructions, but he still didn't know exactly how to build it. This is his final model. What they asked him to do was take that monolith, break it up into different sections, partly so it could communicate more easily with one another, but also because you could build it one segment at a time in case you ran out of money. And that's exactly what happened. NSF ran out of money, so they built the part in the foreground, but the South Tower was never built. Roberts had a nice memo about pay as you go was the he couldn't resist a pun like that. So he did. Pei pulled this thing apart. He allowed it to communicate with different parts of the structure, and you can see in this Ezra Stoller photograph how that's done, so that you have clusters of towers with connecting corridors and lots of spaces along those corridors where you can sit down and talk to a colleague, a blackboard there to work out some of your design problems. And he did, in fact, get the budget down to where it needed to be and delivered the kind of building that Roberts had in mind. The crow's nests there are its most interesting feature. The idea was that you could get away from everybody. You could climb up this little circular staircase and be completely on your own. There's some reasons why that wasn't such a good idea, but it turns out that, you know, it gives it a dramatic look anyway. It's a little porch you can get out on. He also included a fountain, kind of a touch of Alhambra. This too, we'll see, didn't turn out to be a great idea for the same reasons that in the winter it blows it all over the place. And a treed courtyard. So it had everything that Roberts asked for it. It had those contemplative spaces, it had public spaces, and it was small in character. It certainly provided that. And they got the master of concrete that they wanted. These are some of his test panels, but when he actually got around to building it, they used bush hammering. And the idea there was you could turn the concrete into something that looked like monolithic stone, so that you really can't tell at a glance how many stories that actually has. It was expensive to do. Pei convinced them that it was worth the money, and I think the result shows that it was. These are the flat roofs with the little offices there. You climb up through those cylinders, and that's how you get there. Roberts warned Pei, that if you give atmospheric scientists a roof, they will build something on it. Pei was very opposed to that and lost. They built these penthouses, they sprouted antenna, they ruined what he considered the perfect lines of the building, but from their view, of course, it was exactly what was needed. This was a building which shows how you design for one kind of science, but you can't anticipate how it's going to change. This is what atmospheric science was when Pei was commissioned to do this building in 1961. That would change rather dramatically, even in the course of the building, so that wet labs like this one would disappear entirely. Here's the beginning of the construction. Walt Roberts, I must say, was that kind of client who looks over your shoulder all the time, and he would walk up to the Mesa, watch the construction going up. They compared him to a pharaoh watching his great pyramid being built, and he, you know, it was really the achievement of a lifetime for him, more than even his science as this thing went up. When it was done, it was perfectly suited to the kind of science it had been designed to serve, but it was perfectly unsuited for the kind of science that atmospheric research had become. You can see there all the things on the rooftop, etc. Many of the parts of it that Pei thought would work out well didn't. Those crow's nests were very cold in the winter, and of course the postdocs were sent up there rather than the research scientists. When they had the dedication of the building, Walt Roberts praised Pei, and Pei said, well, you know, I'm proudest of those crow's nests. And Roberts told him, it only proves that scientists can work anywhere. But, you know, the lounge area here works beautifully. We had a nice event there last month. Winters, not so much. What it meant was these public spaces could only be used in part of the year. The fountain had to be taken down entirely because it was spraying water and was dripping into the computers underneath, etc. The library, which was one of Pei's proudest achievements in here, became, of course, superfluous. It became either grab and go or find it in your own office. It's still there, but it doesn't serve the purpose that it was once intended to serve. But the thing that really changed it was this. When Walt Roberts commissioned the building, he asked one of the architects about computers. And the architect told him, well, calculating machines will be important, but nothing will ever replace the slide rule. What nobody could anticipate, of course, it wouldn't be the slide rule. It would be the supercomputer that would be required at Mesa Lab to do the complex calculations for climate models. And so, lots of time. So these are the Cray computers. And of course, the computers ended up costing more than the building itself. It started with one, and pretty soon there was a bank of them. The additions that you see to the building are invisible from the surface. They're all underneath. So the extensions were built out to accommodate these computers, but eventually they took up so much power, generated so much heat, and required so much water that they had to be relocated actually to Wyoming. So the building itself is now a symbol of NCAR, but almost all of the real scientific work is done somewhere else and then compiled here. So in a sense, the best view in this building was in the basement, because that's where the computers were, where you could actually put together those climate models. And so, well, a stunning piece of architecture, and of course it appears on the business cards of NCAR employees. It's become an iconic representation. It's the building that says, you know, this is who we are and this is what we do. It's so much part of its identity, it's difficult to imagine ever replacing it because it was such a perfect symbol for what NCAR was. But actually now it's administrative offices. It's not a laboratory at all. This is on the 20th anniversary of the place. Pei and Roberts came together. Roberts, I think, aged worse than Pei did, and I think that's because of all the problems of funding environmental science, et cetera. Ezra Stoller, who took some of those wonderful photographs that you saw, was very good at taking the measure of men as well as buildings, but he talked about how he'd seen Walt Roberts again, and he still seemed to be wearing the same Sears Roebuck suits, and the many battles he'd had to fight and the stress and strains of God knows what administrative infighting had toughened him considerably. Pei still looks pretty darn good in that one. There's a famous book, of course, How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand. And I think this is an interesting example, and I want to end with Brand's thought-provoking ideas about the three kinds of architecture, what he calls the low road and the no road and the high road. And this is the low road. This is building, or was building 20 at MIT. It was a makeshift, temporary place where some of the best science in the post-war world got done. It was, as you well know, replaced by the Stata building, whose occupants really aren't in love with it, where the people who lived here actually were. That's the low road. Another Pei building. This Brand took, maybe unfairly, to be the no road of architectural magazine architecture. Played well with the camera, but it wasn't a place that actually encouraged the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration that he thought it should. Brand did spend a year in that building, so I guess he had some notion of what he was talking about. But Mesa Lab is a building that took the high road. That is, it's a building respected and loved, actually, by its inhabitants. They've learned to make the best of its flaws and foibles and constraints. And as Roberts explained to Pei, and as I think Pei magnificently interpreted in this building, a laboratory, like the scientists in it, have to make and learn from mistakes. It never should be final, just like science is never final. So rewatching Sleeper, I couldn't help but notice this scene. And in it, it shows you all of the sort of, well, I'll let you, and I'll interpret it. This is the final scene. Okay, what's happening there is at the end, the dictator's nose was supposed to be taken by a trained crow and flown off. And they tried it 2 or 3 times, and they couldn't get it to work. So somebody from the lab suggested, why don't you just run it over with because it's right there, we're still building the lab, which they did. But it's that kind of improvisation and collaboration that's exactly what Pei and Roberts wanted. I don't know what the half-life of this building is, or the half-life of any laboratory, but I'll quote Woody Allen on it. He said, "Eternity is a really long time, especially near the end. But until then, NCAR can take, I think, great pride in commissioning a laboratory that has become its symbol for now and for the foreseeable future, a symbol of its unique culture and one of Pei's signature achievements." Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stuart. Thomas Leslie has taught at Iowa State University since 2000. He's published a number of books on architects, sort of peers of Pei, if we can say it that way, including Louis Kahn's Building Art, Building Science on the Chicago skyscrapers, and Beauty's Rigor, Patterns of Production in the work of Pierre Luigi Nervi. Thomas worked in Foster & Partners' office before he started his academic career, first as a fellow at the American Academy of Rome, and as I said, now at Iowa State University. Welcome, Thomas.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and unfortunately, I have no Woody Allen clips. So you have to bear with me. I wanted to break protocol and start not with Pei's thesis project, which would seem the obvious place to begin a discussion of his museums, but a collage by Mies van der Rohe that certainly was one of many inspirations for him 3 years later. And of course, what Pei did was to simply add a building to Mies's sort of famously building less collages. So the reason for this, I think, will become clear shortly. What's interesting, I think, about Pei's thesis and the fact that he went on to become such a famous museum designer is that there's a huge sort of gap in his resume. And as late as the mid-1960s, he had no built work that could be called a sort of major museum. This was an odd gap, since the museum was not only an interest of Pei's, but it had also been an important architectural debate during his formative years. In the building moratorium during World War II, Architectural Forum's forward-looking 1943 issue, Architecture of 1940X, devoted several pages to the museum and post-war society. And Mies's assignment was a prototype museum for an imagined new city, and he suggested an agenda that would sort of come true, that the first problem was to establish the museum as a center for enjoyment, not the internment of art. As a center instead of a monument, the Civic Museum faced serious questions in the media-rich 1950s and 1960s. It had to balance old and new audiences to reflect the art's importance while welcoming broader populations and to accommodate new art forms no longer accommodated by traditional galleries. When museum commissions finally did arrive in Pei's office for the Everson in Syracuse, which came into the office in 1962, and the Des Moines Arts Center in Iowa, which came in 1966, his designs balanced Mies's competing themes: monumentality versus functionality, ordered space versus open plan, and the museum as a sculptural object versus a tectonically expressive architecture. These conflicts were reflected in Pei's material and detailing choices, which balanced and acknowledged brutalist materiality and abstract forms with elements of what Vincent Scully called, in a now long forgotten article, the precisionist strain. And in detailing this, Scully looked to a school of painting from the 20s and 30s called Precisionism that featured, in his words, quote, purity of shape, linearity of detail, and compulsive repetition of elements. Scully argued that this was a particularly American tradition and that it applied equally to Shaker barns, to colonial houses, and to contemporary work in America that he felt was crisper, more, quote, precisionist than the brutalism coming over from Europe. Pei's balances blended diverse influences into a combination of bold form and nuanced detail that was able to win critical acclaim while still proving palatable for an emerging patron class and an enthusiastic public. Helen Everson, a wealthy Syracuse heiress, died in March 1941, leaving in her will money for founding a, quote, Everson Museum of Art, a problematic gift as the city already had a Museum of Fine Arts. After 2 contentious decades, trustees from the 2 organizations joined forces and began plans in 1961 for a new combined building. Their effort aligned with an ambitious, though never realized, urban plan by Victor Gruen that anticipated over 100 acres of urban renewal in the city's then emptying downtown. Among the anticipated buildings in the master plan was the new Fine Arts Center, a choice for the master plan inspired by 2 recent upstate New York museum buildings: Gordon Bunshaft's glass addition to the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, finished in 1962, and Philip Johnson's monolithic Munson Williams Proctor Institute in Utica, finished in 1960. In 1961, the Everson's trustees interviewed Mitchell Jurgala, SOM, Pietro Beluschi, and Pei. Beluschi was their final choice, but he actually recommended Pei as a fellow MIT alum. And for a year, Pei worked with the museum's trustees to develop a response to Gruen's plan, understanding that the museum would have to hold its own while the master plan's remaining structures were realized. Pei and the museum announced preliminary designs in April 1962, and on the very limited site, just 250 by 100 feet, Pei proposed a, quote, distinctive and exciting design of exposed bush-hammered concrete. Pei was motivated, he said, by the need for the museum to be a work of art itself, something sculptural to stand against the rest of the city, but also by its difficult downtown location. To avoid noise from a nearby steam plant, he proposed finally that the museum be focused inward, with solid walls and a central court. Public functions, such as an auditorium and an education wing, were pushed below ground, opening up an entry level to an enclosed central lobby that doubled as a welcoming sculpture gallery. Arrayed around this gallery in a pinwheel-shaped plan were 4 cantilevered concrete boxes linked by second-floor catwalks that contained the galleries proper. Each gallery was cantilevered above an urban square, providing a dramatic monumental presence akin to an oversized piece of minimalist sculpture. Pei's layout achieved several goals. It provided 9 gallery spaces, 4 in the cantilevered boxes, plus the 2-story central sculpture court, 3 smaller spaces under the main galleries, and 1 in the basement that provided a variety of scales. The sculpture court doubled as an entry lobby, but it also gave the museum a valuable social space. And it placed these above 2 vital infrastructural elements, the plaza that linked to the master plan's assumed other elements, and an underground parking garage and loading dock that whisked traffic away from the pedestrian front. The visitor to the Everson just thus arrives on a subtle plaza that, through its stark palette, highlights the 4 concrete stalks that form the main galleries while being framed by an auditorium and members' lounge to the east and west. Henry Moore's brooding sculpture, two-piece reclining figure number 3, provides the urban space with a sculptural focus. Once inside, the sculpture court provides a welcome and orientation, lifting the eye to the bridge connections between galleries above and to a waffle slab ceiling set apart from the 4 gallery masses by skylights and windows. The circular concrete stairway in the court provides evident access to the upper level, and I think it's kind of interesting to think of this in the library of NCAR that we just saw. But it also functions as a sculptural element itself, and this was praised and criticized by reviewers who found its dynamic presence either an homage or a competitor to other artworks displayed in this space. Each of the Everson's galleries varies in plan and section, but they share a material palette of oak floors and linen wall linings. These contrast with the structure's rough exposed concrete, which contains a local red granite aggregate exposed by the bush-hammered finish. Pei further emphasized this warm, textured finish by detailing the corrugations to run diagonally, a subtle foil to the museum's rectilinear forms. Pattern, texture, detail, and material combine in a particularly rich visual experience. Quote, "The carefully arranged and detailed sequences and play of space and light," wrote Ada Louise Huxtable, "the changing views of art form and color, the way the pedestrian moves and experiences and enjoys all this, this," she said, "is architecture." Huxtable became one of Pei's true champions in the 60s, and she went on to describe the Everson as, quote, "comfortably monumental," reflecting its numerous influences. Critics compared it to the stark Pilotis-supported National Museum of Western Art in Tokyo by Le Corbusier, or to Marcel Breuer's stark concrete forms. But the Everson crucially also won praise for its warmth, blending, according to Harper's editor Russell Lines, a, quote, "grandeur of scale with a, quote, meticulous and caring attention to detail." Its textural range and its taut dialogues with artwork formed for Huxtable, quote, "an object lesson in art and museology," a conclusion that must have pleased Pei, by this point an accomplished art collector himself. Pei's next museum commission for the Des Moines Art Center in Iowa posed different challenges. This center already had a building designed by Ieoh and Ieoh Saarinen in 1946-48, and it had a sylvan open site in Greenwood Park, west of the city's downtown. The center was an open museum with no admission charges and admissions split between art's display and its making, with studios and classrooms occupying one whole wing. The Saarinen's work fit well into Des Moines' progressive spirit. The city had become a financial center, but it remained hungry for the cultural status that other regional cities had won with imposing civic museums. The Saarinen scheme, though, was an inversion of the pre-war museum design principles, eschewing grandiosity for a rambling S-shaped plan that hugged Greenwood Park's contours. The Saarinens split their scheme into two halves. The plan's eastern end included the education wing, while the western end contained an auditorium, a lobby, and two linear galleries for the museum's collection, wrapped around a long axis that descended into the park's wooded lowlands along an existing rose garden. The Saarinens terminated this axis with a deep reflecting pool, wrapped on three sides by the gallery wing's walls and punctuated by a Carl Milesch sculpture, Pegasus and Bellerophon. The Saarinens' design was praised for its approachable quality, its emphasis on youth, and its palette of regional limestone, and it exemplified the new agenda for museums as community centers rather than monuments. The entire building is strictly functional, but simplicity has notable warmth, a local critic wrote. The style, he wrote, is modern, explaining to his Midwestern audience, which apparently means honest. By the 1960s, the Art Center's trustees sought to expand its gallery and auditorium facilities. Art had changed in the short decade and a half since the center's opening, and its domestic scale was unable to accommodate sculptural works by new artists such as Tony Smith or Louise Bourgeois. In 1965, the trustees approached Saarinen's successor firm, Roche Dinkeloo, about extending the building, but the firm declined. Pei was by this point still without a completed museum building. The delayed Everson would not be open for another 2 years. Nonetheless, they interviewed him in fall 1965, and Art Center trustee David Krudenier recalled later that Pei, quote, sketched a plan and elevation so close to the final product that the sheer act of creativity left me breathless. Pei's sketch proposed an aggressive dialogue with the Saarinens' quiet massing. He suggested that the new wing, instead of extending the original building's serpentine logic, could reinvent it by sitting astride the rose garden axis, turning the Saarinens' open pool space into a closed courtyard, and linking the gallery wing's end with the joint between the education and gallery wings. This would take advantage of the land's gradual fall away from the pool, allowing Pei to create a double-height gallery space facing the rose garden. And making the new sculptural gallery a linking element created a curatorial loop, allowing patrons to see the entire collection without backtracking. This circulatory simplification came with dramatic changes to the courtyard's original conception. Here, Pei employed a subtlety that complemented his bold massing solution. While the new wing's east and west walls are rendered in a heavy bush-hammered concrete similar to the Eversons, the north and south walls facing the rose garden and courtyard are mostly glass, framed with thinner horizontal and vertical concrete elements. Furthermore, in plan, Pei developed this directionality into a framed structure that relies on attenuated concrete fins, also extended in the north-south direction and laid out around a single square bay in the gallery's center. Two staircases, one connecting to the auditorium under the upper gallery level and the other pulled out to the exterior wall and accessed by a long concrete bridge, emphasize the gallery's visual and spatial grain. Pei's design for the roof is also striking. A large gull-wing-shaped pair of skylights open to the north and south, bathing the upper and lower galleries in light that is directional and moderated, ideal conditions for viewing sculpture. Throughout, Pei used simple materials. Corduroy-like bush-hammered concrete contrasts with plain board-formed or as-struck surfaces, and with travertine floors and vast glass areas. Limestone aggregate in the concrete reflects the limestone in the Saarinens' original structure. And in addition to closing the courtyard off from the garden, Pei moved the auditorium staircase from the upper gallery out into the courtyard pool. The Milesch sculpture was relocated to act as a formal counterpoint to the stairs enclosure, creating a visual balance of metal and concrete, dynamic and static form that adds a spatial tension to the now intimate, rather found courtyard. While the Eversons' design created a strong, inwardly focused urban form, the Art Center sprung from far different requirements, creating space in harmony with already existing galleries and landscapes. At Des Moines, Pei's building adds a formal grain to the bold minimalist forms of the Everson. The Art Center's double and single height areas reflect the Everson's sectional conception, and the Everson sculptural stair is repeated in condensed form. The Des Moines project, however, contains no one external point or circuit where the building's sculptural nature can be seen as a whole. Instead, it's experienced as two facades, one facing the courtyard that features the thrusting stair enclosure and axial views, the other from the garden axis that renders the building's circulation, structure, and gallery into an abstract grid of concrete walls and sunshades. The building as a whole is experienced only from inside, highlighting Pei's orchestrated dialogues between ordered form and rough textured materiality. The importance of space to the Arts Center was hinted at by some of Pei's graduate school writing on urbanism. The essence of a vessel, he wrote, is its emptiness. A city, he said, is a vessel too, a container for people and for life. The Arts Center reverses the Everson's strong formal presence in exactly this way. It is instead an empty vessel that coheres only as its gallery and landscape circuits are traversed. While its forms have been described as sculptural, the Arts Center is not a sculpture, as the Everson is. Instead, it derives its meaning from its relation to the building that it completes, the axis that it inhabits, and the vessel's visual and textural experience itself. The Arts Center's construction was more rapid than the Everson's, and the two actually opened within a few weeks of each other in 1968. The Arts Center on October 1st and the Everson on October 27th. Together, the buildings struck a similar chord for their monumental presences and inviting spaces, their tough but warm material palettes, and their thoughtful, if radical, approaches to context. Both received AIA honor awards in 1969, the Arts Center for its boldly contrived concrete and graceful massiveness, and the Everson for being a, quote, firm but sympathetic habitation for quiet water and restless art. In 1974, criticizing Gordon Bunshaft's attempt to achieve a similar balance with the Hirshhorn Museum on the National Mall, Huxtable offered the Everson as an example of how a building could be a container for artwork and a work of art itself, though her praise, I would argue, could also refer to the Des Moines building. The museum, she wrote, quote, offers complex and sensitive relationships that make the art come even more alive, unlike Bunshaft's heavy, lifeless brutality. Pei's conception for both museums was a container that balanced brutalism's bold forms with precisionism's refinements. The Everson and the Arts Center are resolute, unapologetic, even aggressive. Yet these initial impacts are followed through with finely scaled spaces, intuitive circulation, and crisp detailing. If, in fact, Pei was a brutalist, his brutalism was a tailored one, tempering raw materials with more polished ones, and marrying rough surfaces to fine edges. While his plans are diagrammatic, they never appear forced. Rather, they reflect a clear resolution of often competing ideals: structural order, sculptural form, but also circulation, daylighting, curatorial flexibility, etc., into legible spaces. There is none of what Rayner Banham called the bloody-mindedness that was brutalism's hallmark, though Pei's stark forms give the appearance of such a relentlessness. He was able in these two projects to achieve a fluent balance between bold, uncompromising forms, which made his work popular in architectural circles, and refined spaces of exquisite sensitivity that appealed more to patrons, donors, and the community alike. This incredible agility to design uncompromising forms that were nevertheless efficient and welcoming helped to make Pei's reputation as a master civic and cultural architect, and subsequent projects furthered these dialogues. The Herbert Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell, finished in 1973, extended the Everson sectional diagram to frankly ludicrous proportions, towering over the campus to provide views over Lake Cayuga. Pei's, quote, sophisticated mastery of space and light made this a logical extension of his museum design principles, a mixed bag of what Huxtable called essentially conflicting uses that Pei was able to resolve into an elegantly refined solution. The Mellon Center at Choate Rosemary Hall in Wallingford, Connecticut was praised similarly by the New York Times as a, quote, handsome pile of beige concrete and glass, and as yet another thoughtful balancing of conflicting programmatic elements, an 800-seat theater, studios, and art galleries in a building designed to connect two preparatory school campuses. This combination of attention-grabbing form with a genteel savoir-faire became Pei's signature approach to his greatest art commissions, the East Wing and the Louvre Pyramid. His work to bridge functional, civic, and architectural desires in Syracuse and Des Moines remained consistent in these larger works. And eschewing the era's more dogmatic formalism, for instance, of Bunshaft or Rudolph, as well as its energetic theorizing, Pei instead negotiated a middle ground that proved productive and appealing. The two personable monuments at Syracuse and Des Moines show Pei's ability to appeal across broad social and cultural spectrums, evidenced by the two buildings' continued functional and architectural success. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Delin Lai is now professor of art at the professor of the history of art at University of Louisville, where he specializes in modern Chinese architecture, cities, and their relationship, sort of east-west dialectic across modernism. He's the lead editor of a 5-volume book on the history of Chinese modern architecture, published in 2016. Delin.
And it's a great honor of mine to stand here, the school of Mr. Pei, and to share my understanding of this master, whom I knew of upon I get into college in 1980, and since then have admired. Yeah. My topic today is defining the present perfect tense of Ieoh Pei's space. Ieoh Pei is a modernist master whose distinctive architectural language not only features geometric forms, but also in the flowing space to embody or encircle the form. For Pei, space is both a means of generating architectural drama and, more importantly, a way to facilitate communication between human, nature, and even history. This presentation attempts to locate Pei's space in the context of both modernist architecture and the Chinese architectural tradition. In addition, I also hope to conceptualize space contribution to the modernist concept, quote-unquote, space-time, by expanding it to incorporate the present perfect tense of time. Pei's first design involved the relationship between architectural space and the natural environment was a museum for Chinese art, Shanghai. His Master of Art project at Harvard Graduate School of Design completed under Walter Gropius in 1946. In this design, he combined several courtyard or small individual garden patio, arguably the hallmark of his public building designs throughout his later career. In the museum consisting of several pavilions and a stream running through a tea garden. In 1935, Mies van der Rohe had designed the Huber House as a combination of courtyard and modern residence, which was later named Atrium House. Certainly, Mies' avant-garde design should not have been alien to a GSD student like Pei. But Pei's notion of courtyard space might have received influence from two more immediate sources. His life experience represents one source. Another is the scholarly work on Chinese gardens published in 1930s and 1940s. It is widely known that Pei grew up in Suzhou, where his family owned the famous Lion Forest Garden that was also his favorite playground. And pay attention to this door, gate, here. I will show it later, His later love of garden life was likely also cultivated by two best-selling English books on Chinese life and culture published when he was studying in the United States, My Country and My People, and The Importance of Living, published in 1936 and 1937, respectively, by Lin Yutang, a well-known humanist writer in modern China. Both Lin's books portray idealized mode of living environment that alluded by Chinese gardening, which, as he believed, could harmonize the relationship between humans and nature. In particular, Lin criticized modern urban life in the importance of living by imitating the voice of God, who chastised a man clamoring for a heaven with the pearly gates while failing to recognize the beauty of the earth. After saying, I quote, "You presumptuous, ungrateful rat, so this planet is not good enough for you. I will therefore send you to hell, where you shall not see the sailing clouds and the flowering trees, nor hear the gurgling brooks, and live there forever till the end of your days." End quote. God then punished the man by sending him to live in the city apartment. By contrast, Lin praised life in Chinese garden home, saying that the Chinese house and the garden, I quote, present a more intricate aspect that deserves a special attention. The principle of harmony with nature is carried further, for in the Chinese conception, the house and the garden are not separate, but are parts of organic whole, as evidenced in the phrase "yuan zhai," or garden home, end quote. Lin's work was part of the first upsurge in research of Chinese gardens. In the mid-1930s, the English journal Tianxia Monthly, for which Lin worked, published a series of articles on this subject. Two authors of the journal later became the contributors of the book, Chinese Houses and Gardens, arguably the first English monograph on Chinese garden, which was edited by Shaochang Li with photos taken by Henry Im and published in 1940. And GSD has this collection since November 7, 1940, the time when Pei was here. Yeah. In light of the new, and also pay attention to this gate, so in this book. So I believe if Pei saw this book, he will feel homesick. Yeah. In light of the new trend of the modernist design and the new interest in Chinese garden tradition, it is not surprising to see the inclusion of the atrium or even the garden in the designs of young generation of modern Chinese architects. Pei's first home was such a yuan zhai, in which he and his wife created a little garden. As he said in the interview, it is, I quote, very small but very Chinese, with some grasses and flowers, which reminded us of China. I don't know whether Mr. Sandy Pei remember this house. He also employed the idea of courtyard in the design of a campus building at the Tonghai University in Taiwan in 1953. Wang Dahong, a Chinese peer of Pei at Harvard, who also lived in Suzhou in the early 1930s, designed an atrium townhouse and published in the Interior magazine in January 1945. Mr. Wang Dahong also celebrated his 100th birthday this year. Though the magazine's editor seemingly intended to link Wang's design to Greco-Roman architectural tradition, it is clear that Wang was envisioning a garden house with Chinese influence when he added such details as the hanging scroll here, painting and the penjing flower arrangement, and in particular the fish pond with lotus leaves and the dwarf trees. Wang continued his idea in houses he designed in Taiwan for a number of clients with details from Chinese houses and the gardens. And he used the details from that book. So did Chinese-American architect Ieoh Wang, a student of Miss Vanderrohe at Illinois Institute of Technology in the early 1950s. Huang also received recognition for the atrium houses he designed in Chicago during the 1960s. Certainly, Pei had more opportunities than both Wang and Huang to interpret the idea of the atrium house for large-scale public building designs. As has been widely recognized, in addition to natural elements, Pei's designs emphasized the importance of space, which, I quote, motivated people to move in buildings, end quote. Pei's notion of movement echoes what Le Corbusier called the architectural promenade. It also reminds us of the concept of space-time, or space-time, that Sigrid Gideon, then professor of the GSD, codified in his 1941 book, Space-Time and Architecture, The Growth of a New Tradition. In this modern classic, Gideon delineated an architectural history with the development of architectural space as the key criterion in defining different historical periods. Modern architecture differs from previous traditions by making movement a part of spatial experience. Modern space is no longer just three-dimensional, but also combines time. Though Gideon's notion was new to most students of modern architecture, it might not have been fresh to Pei and others who were acquainted with the spatial experience of Chinese gardens. In the 1950s, some Chinese architects who encountered the concept of quote-unquote flowing space already recognized its similarity with the Chinese idea of 不移景异, or view changes with the moving of paces. Pei also discussed the significance of movement in his architecture in terms of Chinese garden. Quote, movement is something I learned from the Chinese gardens. Chinese gardens are always built in a very small place because there are so many people and the land is so limited. Within a very small place of land, one can create a maximum variety. Why? Because of the constantly changing perspective. It is the opposite of garden like Versailles. The Oriental garden is designed to engage the visitor with a series of surprises. Once you think you have seen the most exciting object, a rock or something, and then you turn around and see something else. And then you turn again, constant movement and change. In designing space, you also have to do that. You have to create surprises so that you make people want to discover more. You make people turn left, turn right, or go straight ahead. So you do have to motivate. That is the word you have to use, people to look and explore. Pei's Fragrant Hill Hotel in Beijing, which opened in 1982, was his first large public project that showed his reinterpretation of Chinese architectural traditions. This work came at a time when the international world of architecture was witnessing the popularization of postmodernism and when its new criteria, such as meaning, legibility, and double codes, were challenging the modernist pursuit of function, abstraction, as well as quote-unquote designer's meaning, as Amos Rappaport's term. In China, the search for an architecture with Chinese characteristics had also been underway for nearly a century. Pei disregarded either the curved roof and the decorative motifs employed by many Chinese architects or what Charles Janks called the metaphorical exaggeration or syntax distortion in popular postmodern works. Instead, hoped to quote, find out a new approach as a small token to pay the cultural debt that I owed to where I was from, end quote. In his hotel design, Pei selected the three merits from different sources in the Chinese architectural tradition and reinterpreted them from a modernist perspective. The first is the purity of the white painted wall with the gray tile trim associated with the vernacular architecture in South China, especially Suzhou. The second is the movement facilitated in the free plan of Chinese gardens and the interaction between interior space and exterior environment in this plan. Yeah. The third is the simplicity of geometric forms of circle and square. The combined motif circle, square, and the square circle appeared as the first illustration in the Song Dynasty architectural manual, 营造法式, and were introduced in Chinese lattice designs, an English book published in 1974 by Daniel Shih Dai. Though with slight variations, Pei's Miho Museum in Kyoto and the Suzhou Museum in Suzhou, two of his other Asian designs also embody the three merits of the Fragrant Hill Hotel. Their spatial design, which combines the views of the natural surroundings with the movement, demonstrate a half-century later the development of Pei's atrium design in his Harvard GSD project. What makes the flowing space in Pei's Chinese and Japanese cases different from the Corbusian architectural promenade is then their association with Chinese history. For example, the stone platform of the floating cup canal in the garden of the Fragrant Hill Hotel is the symbolic artifact referring to Wang Xizhi's preface to the poems collected from the Orchid Pavilion. The bridge of Miho Museum is a spatial allusion to Tao Yuanming's poem, Peach Blossom Valley. In designing the Suzhou Museum, Pei transplanted into its interior a branch of ivy planted by Wen Hengshan, an ancient remains of humble administrative gardens. Here. He thus rendered the new architecture of the 21st century with the personal touch of the Ming literati artist Wen Zhengming. One might say that, compared with Le Corbusier and Gideon's concept, the most significant development made by Pei is the tense of the space, where the concept of these two modernist masters involves no tense other than the present one. Pei's Asian designs exhibited present perfect tense through their use of allusions, namely the historical associations with Chinese art and literature. Different from quote-unquote past tense of the revivalist design, as well as quote-unquote future tense of the futurist designs, the present perfect tense connects the past and the present, thus adding a historical dimension to the continuum of visitors' spatial experience, and convert such experiences into a conversation between the cultural legacy of the past and life in the present. The present perfect tense can often be experienced in Chinese literature and painting, which use allusion, inscription, or collage to expand the dimension of time exhibited by language or visual form. In Chinese architecture, especially in scenic sites and gardens, designers who wish to create a poetic environment have always favored directive elements that brings historical past to the present. For instance, a hole in the Lion Forest Garden is named Li Xue, or standing in snow. It refers to the story about the 6th century monk Hui Ke, who waited in the snow outside a cave for Bodhidharma's teaching when the latter was in meditation. With a cypress tree in the courtyard, a pavilion in the same garden is named Zhibai, or pointing to a cypress, alluding to the story of famous Song Dynasty Chan Buddhist master Zhao Zhou, who repeatedly pointed to a cypress tree as a way to divert a student from his obsession in study. And the hole named Yunlin Yiyun, or the lofty spirit of Yunlin, reminds visitors of the Yuan Dynasty master Ni Zan. Besides the textual inscriptions or historical names, ancient remains and symbolic artifacts also help expand the historical dimension of a spatial environment. In the Lion Forest Garden, for example, there are bountiful steles with inscriptions of ancient masters or historical figures, including the piece attributed to the Song Dynasty hero Wen Tianxiang and the Qing Emperor Qianlong, as well as old trees, including those named 5 ancient pines and the flying dragon. I distinguish these artifacts as ancient remains, whereas a hua fang, or stone boat, with decorative upper structure in this garden can be taken as a symbolic artifact. Though incapable of moving itself, its anchorless feature makes it a visualization of Bu Xi Zhou, or a boat without docking lines, an analogy made by the Taoist master Zhuangzi to an unrestrained individual. To borrow Charles Sanders Peirce's semiotic terms, the inscription, ancient remains, and the symbolic artifacts are indices, icons, and symbols respectively. As signs, they help create spatial allusions and hence expand the historical dimension of Chinese gardens. The peach blossom spring, the branch of ivy cultivated by Wenhengshan, as well as the floating cup canal in Pei's architecture are such signs. Pei may have read Lin Yutang's works and Henry Ying's Chinese Houses and Gardens, but he may have benefited more immediately from his direct communication with Chen Congzhou, a distinguished scholar of Chinese gardens. Pei and Chen knew each other in the late 1970s when Chen was working on the Astor Chinese Garden Court for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Pei sought advices from Chen while then designing the Fragrant Hill Hotel. In addition to scholar, Chen was also a poet, painter, calligrapher, and keen lover of tea drinking and Kunqu opera. His discussion of Chinese gardens thus took the perspective of literati scholar as a qualified viewer. In the opening chapter of his well-known work, Shuoyuan, or On Chinese Gardens, Chen regarded the cultural interest as the complementary factor contributing to the beauty of Chinese garden. He said, I quote, "Why is it that Chinese scenic places and classical gardens attract countless visitors, and one can view them over 100 times without even ever being satiated? No doubt, the beauty of the scenery is an important reason, but the culture and the history are other key factors. I've already mentioned that object of cultural interest and the historical site enrich scenic spots and gardens and produce even greater pleasure and broad association in visitors who will not then come merely to sightsee, eat, and take a cup of tea." By incorporating historical dimension in the space of Fragrant Hill Hotel, Miho Museum, and the Suzhou Museum, Pei not only responded to both his patrons and the postmodernist desire for cultural associations and architectural meaning, but also expanded the modernist concept of space-time with a tense. In China, two well-known architects, Feng Jizhong and the much younger Wang Shu, also endeavored to render their architectural space with patina of time. With structures of different historical periods displayed on one side, Feng's Square Pagoda Garden in Shanghai showcases his idea of Yugu Weixin, or creating newness out of antique. So too does the Pritzker laureate Wang, who is known for his creative use of old building materials collected from demolishing site. If Feng and Wang's strategy can best be called a collage aligned with ideas of painting, the ancient Chinese associations in Pei's designs, for example, for expanding the dimension of time, can be aligned with allusion embedded in literature. The collage approach resorts to visual sources, and the allusion approach resorts to history and literature ones. While the former helps to make Feng and Wang's designs picturesque, the latter, by enriching the expressional function of a built environment, helps to make Pei's abstract modern design poetic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'll ask the panelists to join, to gather to the table, please. So we actually have a good bit of time for discussion, and I do want to be able to turn to the audience quickly. So, and I'd also like to try to make this, if it's possible, not so much Q&A as conversation. We'll see how if we can do that. I'll suggest some things. One of the things that's come up a couple of times just in last night and today was, for example, with Andre Badu and I were talking about, while there's not a dearth of publication, it's not that there's no publications on Pei. There are plenty of coffee table books, and certainly he's as well known outside the profession as any architect. I mean, maybe in the profession he's one among many, but outside the profession he's surely one of the best known American architects, or even global architects. But there is a dearth of serious interpretive work and serious theorizing or researching of Pei's work. And I'd like to reflect on that a little bit, if we could, why that's the case. I mean, comparisons came up today, not so much Kahn, though there might have been more comparisons to Kahn. Some of you have worked on Kahn, but certainly Breuer, Bunshaft, and these are people who, you know, PhD students do dissertations on them. I don't know that there's I'm sure there is several dissertations on Pei, but I don't, he doesn't seem to be someone that presents interpretive problems. And I'd like to try to explore why that is. It can't be because he did, let's say, he did some great work and some mediocre work, or some, you know, it was a large, he produced more buildings than any of the others, but all the others had mediocre work as well. That's just the nature of the profession. So that can't be it. Is it that he was too, was he formulaic? I was struck that the, between the museum in the Mesa, the the Everson Museum and the Mesa Lab, both around 1961, right? So they were very close together. I was struck that there was, and they're not, I'm not saying they're alike, but they certainly have, at bottom, a kind of fondness for the inverted L. I mean, the Mesa Lab is much more broken up, but I wouldn't say it's adjusted to the site. It's still placed on the site. If you compare some of Corbusier's work, the late work in Chandigarh, it's there because of the site, and he's constantly drawing it, whereas I feel like Pei is placing it. And I wonder, is he too formulaic? Is he too certain of his form that it doesn't present a problem of interpretation? Is the talk about, and some people, I don't know if we still have people who were in the office maybe when some of these things were done. There was a lot of talk last night and back at another Pei conference about material. And it's absolutely, the lecture this morning, it was absolutely, it's fascinating to hear how the office dealt with material. But does that take away, remember our panelists, form and space, so does that take away from complicated issues of form, or does that take away from interpreting it in broader, less technical terms, less empirical terms, and more in cultural terms, in historical terms? Could we reflect on that?
Well, I think, why aren't there more kind of scholarly and critical work on Pei? Is that my question? I mean, as I think we see, Pei didn't have an avant-garde moment. Mm-hmm. You know, he spent that point in his life working for a developer, mm-hmm. which you could think of as being a very rebellious thing to do, but not typically mm-hmm. in that way. I don't know if the work feels like it's forward, look kind of at the avant-garde at a particular moment, which I think is what architectural history is still looking for, those firsts and those mm-hmm. origins at moments. And as we've been talking about, the practice, to its credit, was so professional mm-hmm. and so gained establishment clients so immediately that I think, you know, there's a preference in academia for kind of rebels and outsiders, and both as personalities and also a work that has that sort of difficulty to it. And we see the work is so accomplished. So at least though I've thought about that too. I think the opening comparison of Pei to McKim, Mead, and White was very apropos. It took a long time for there to be any kind of academic treatment of McKim, Mead, and White as well. And I would wonder if Pei wouldn't also then be subject in a generation or so to that same type of serious treatment than McKim, Mead, and White received. You know, it took some time.
Thomas?
I think that's true. I think there's a fine line between fluency and facility, and fluency is admirable, but it's not particularly romantic, or it doesn't maybe have a strong narrative to it. And having worked on Cannes, where everything was a struggle and everything had a kind of story to it, the better Pei's buildings are, almost like the more boring the story is. He comes into an impossible problem and very cleverly figures it out and executes it brilliantly. And that makes for fantastic buildings, but as a scholar, I think sometimes you do want more complexity or more difficulty, something with a little more tooth to it. And I think that's one of the challenges, I think, of establishing a kind of Pei scholarship is, what's at stake essentially. And I think the parallel to McKim, Mead, and White there is a good one. The scholarship on McKim, Mead, and White is often looking at sources and comparing, how the practice worked. And I think that especially from the session this morning, I think one of the clear paths that could be developed is the fact that Pei gets very little credit for all of the technical innovation that clearly he established, and that strikes me as probably the most fruitful direction, maybe.
Actually, I agree with Tom. So this morning's discussion actually are very quite thought-provoking, and the dimension actually, as an architectural historian, is overlooked for quite a long time. So the technology part, and in terms of form and other concept, I think Pei's designs are not very avant-garde and all not very revolutionary, but he can bring the principles of modernism into perfectness, and also make avant-garde classic. So this is a kind of beauty. We can use J.J. Winckelmann's term, the noble simplicity and the quiet beauty. So he rendered modern architecture with the flavor of classicism. This is what I understand about Pei's design. I think he is always a nobleman, a gentleman in life and in design.
Yeah, I guess I would say he was too good at working with his clients. If I compare him with Saarinen says, here's your laboratory, live in it. Pei is somebody who is willing to compromise, rethink, and restructure. I think that makes a big difference.
Delin suggested something that I was fascinated with, and I don't know, you didn't have a lot of time to develop it, so maybe, and I was going to try to bring some of the other projects into Delin's idea of the present perfect. The present perfect tense is the one that I've been looking at this cypress tree a long time now. It's in the past, but it's still continuing into the present, and I found that fascinating because But then I began to think, and it was quite compelling, the idea that the Chinese garden, which he was well aware of and also literate in the study of, that I found that very compelling. But to me, that might be a little bit different notion of time than one in which the building itself somehow registers time or traces time. And I was struck again that the bush-hammered concrete, for example, it might be a kind of act of archaicizing the project, aging it intentionally. But I've always been fascinated as the Seagram building, now that they've stopped kind of cleaning it and washing it, it's taken on this patina on the bronze that it almost looks archaic rather than modern. And I wonder if there's something about that. On the other hand, Pei's work doesn't seem to age. It seems to always be new, or it always should be new. And who was it that said brutalism versus pristinism? Precisionism, brutalism versus precisionism, and it was that dialectic which I like very much. But that seems a dialectic that takes place in the present, not in the past. I'm not sure. But all of the buildings, all of you, except for, well, Danny didn't mention this because it was more of an urban project, but within the buildings, there was always traces of movement, or there was always formal, the stairs are pulled out and they're exaggerated, and the handrails are solid, and this idea of movement through space and movement through time, that I think was something that began to thicken Delin's idea of a present perfect. I don't know if that occurs throughout the work more than the projects we saw today.
And I would like to suggest probably some buildings he designed, also just like Louvre, use pyramid. This is a symbol also of history. And also in what's the name of the concert hall in Texas? There are a large circle, right? So it's, oh yes, Meyerson Concert Hall. Actually, this is, I think this circle came from Richardson, right? So the arch, but Pei just exaggerated it. So this kind of connection with the previous tradition, with previous master, I think in Pei's later work is, to me, is noticeable. Although he probably didn't or have not elaborated, but give me some sense. Yeah.
I thought coming back, maybe asking for a little more comment on the site planning. I mean, the planning of the Des Moines project is exquisite. It's smart, but it's also beautiful. It's beyond smart. And the way the section, we needed a section through the hill to see that. And that seemed to be a high point for me. I also felt like in Des Moines, because of more constraint, because of having to work on top of the Saarinen, I thought it was one of the most beautiful solutions, and one of the most open in the sense of like you open up, like you make yourself available, like you become, responding and inviting. I guess it was more inviting. But let's come back to the other. I mean, Danny was very critical of the earliest urbanistic attempts. And one realizes it comes back, first of all, to issues of patronage. Developers and cities and states don't make maybe as ideal patrons as museum directors, and that's part of it. The other thing that I couldn't understand fully was exactly how much room did he have to operate. It was difficult to tell where was the designer making the decision and where was the BRA or whatever it would have been, the city planning making the decisions. And also it comes back to last night, yes, sorry, the days are running together, to this issue of the office organization. I mean, was a young Harry Cobb just handed this because it was so unpromising? We talked last night about how in the Pei office from the start, the principal designers were given a lot of autonomy. Is this just giving it to Harry to get his teeth, or is urbanism not part of the primary parameter? If you think of the Hancock building and Bill Pedersen's high-rises as being the peak of the legacy of Pei's urbanism, they're all very singular, monolithic objects in the city. And I'm wondering if that tendency, that sensibility, it just wasn't the right project for him or something.
Michael, to answer the question about the limitations, as I would understand it, is that the Pei office was brought in not to author the plan, but to give it an authority. That is, it was a big name, and they, for whatever reason, Adams, Howard, and Greeley just seemed to be up to the task of finishing and refining the plan. I think as that has much to do with was preparing it for submission for review and approval and up to the federal authorities. And also Pei's office had had a staff to do it. In terms of why Cobb got it, I can only say that Cobb said to me it was because he really cared about urban issues, and that he was the one who was at that time really thinking about urbanism and the city scale. I think when Cobb spoke last spring, he talked about how his own thesis work at Harvard was at the scale of the city, and that even though Cobb said that the firm was always interested in civic architecture, that Pei himself was more interested in the architectural end. So I don't know. That's the impression that I got. But it was clearly a plan. It was clearly a project without much opportunity for the Pei office to do anything. You know, I think they were brought in to quickly kind of refine it and get the documents set.
I think it would be misleading to think that because it's up on a mountain that the Mesa lab is somehow not an urban project. It was. It was required by Boulder approval to move a water line beyond what it had been. It's hidden. You don't appreciate Pei's genius till you drive up it. It's about a 6% grade, and so you see it, then it disappears, you see it again, and then you turn in the plaza. But it was very much within an urban plan of Boulder. It was not, it's not a rural site in that sense.
What's surprising about the Boulder site, since I only saw it once, was since I worked in the office and I helped do some of the rendering, dotting the little trees, I was surprised to see that directly below it, which you don't see in photographs, it's a conventional housing development. There are homes very close by. Had the camera moved just a little bit more, you would see suburbia right there. Let me see if I can help identify how projects are assigned in the office. Not in the early days, but gradually as the name of the office changed. On one occasion, I received a phone call, and it had to do, I forgot the name of it, on aging. Yeah, no, there's a laboratory.
The one in Bucks.
Yeah, Buck Center on aging. The operator happened to give me the telephone because Mr. Pei was not there. And so I answered on behalf of the office. And the person specifically asked for Mr. Pei. So later on, I thought nothing more of it until evidently time came to decide whether to take the commission or not. And Mr. Pei called me in and said, tell me exactly what happened in the phone call. So I said, I mentioned your name. He said, that's all I need to know. So oftentimes when projects come into the office, it's a question of which partner responded without any infighting, so you take it. I've never been into a partners meeting. I only reached the role of an associate partner, so one rank below. And I suspect that assignments generally are made as to who the rainmaker was. Harry, Boston is virtually his territory in a lot of projects he knows about. And so it's very common, very easy for him to assume the responsibility.
It was helpful, yeah.
Thank you. This is apropos placing a building into a site. I think specifically with regard to, with NCAR, that south tower that was not built, that really was intended to really grasp on to the Mesa. And that would have changed that dynamic entirely. Taking it a further step, the way the buildings are placed, there's kind of a running joke I have with myself that the site is only the beginning, right? And that really where the journey begins is on your front door. They took into account what the approach streets were, what the metro system was. Every aspect of urbanism factored into the building and how it was sited. And so too, in Kips Bay, that being a mega block, how it was divided up to a court with the neighboring streets. Things that, it's kind of great scenography, but of a profound level. So I don't think it's so much a placement in. I think it is critically related to all the factors that surround the site.
That's very helpful. I think somehow I feel like we historians, critics, interpreters don't have the right lens yet for Pei and the Pei office, insofar as all of us today, we haven't gotten much beyond, the best one is brutalism versus precisionism. We haven't gotten much beyond a received view of this work, which is that it's all about the concrete, which does not take, I mean, the concrete's clearly important, but there's so much more about the buildings, it seems, from your comment, that don't have to do with the purely visible, that there's a lot of things going on that are out of sight that contribute to the inhabitation and the use and the experience of the building that don't always come out in the photographs or even the drawings if you don't look at them, right? And I think that I felt that a lot about Pei's work, that the full experience of it, the video programs that have been made of Pei, for example, they're always about light, because video is very good at demonstrating how light works, and yet you can't study that unless you go there. And I think that's what I mean by kind of we have a limited vocabulary or a limited lens for looking at some of these buildings that I think maybe conferences like this should prompt. I mean, I'm hoping students will start to pick up on this idea that the invisible part of some of these projects.
May I just pop
Sure,
in
sure.
one other thing? Thinking back to your question earlier about why, in fact, there's not been serious scholarship, I wonder if it doesn't have something to do with the buildings being so popular that there isn't a perceived need to go in deeper. But knowing what I do about certain projects, I think there are great stories in there.
No, I think
but they're not immediately apparent. And so I think the initial interest in it is in the form and the popularity of it, and then it's on to something else, but no one goes really deep in.
Yeah, no, it's helpful, yeah. Other comments from the audience? Yes. Hang on just one till we get the microphone.
Delin, I was interested in the origins of his Chinese association with gardens, as well as then I'm going to extrapolate into the Japanese period, which was collateral to Pei, such as Kenzo Tange, who was a brutalist, but he was also influenced by traditional Japanese architecture. And then Maki, who is always one of my great favorites, also was a GSD guy. And Arata Isazaki then did a show at the Cooper Hewitt, which regrettably I didn't get a chance to go to, which was on Ma space. And Ma space is a characteristic of, in that case, the Japanese interpretation of space, which is quite elaborate. It's not just isolated to one idea, but it stretches and it penetrates. And I'm interested in Pei's Chinese association with space, modernist interpretation of space, which to some extent might have been more Vitruvian or golden section oriented, but that there's a naturalism in the East Asian view towards space, which might be a little different than modernism, which could be a kick into the architectural forms in a way that Western architects don't necessarily get.
Delin, can you speak to this?
Actually, I'm sorry, I haven't fully probably digest your question. And but in terms of
The question would be more like the contrasting styles from which the modernist movements arise from the two different points of view.
oh, you mean Japanese and the Chinese
Versus Western.
versus Western? Yeah.
If that's true.
Yes. Yeah. No, I was just going to suggest, for example, the clear geometric underpinning
Yes.
of Pei.
Yes, it's
I think a
Western.
Westerner sees it differently than your work asks us to see it. Even the use of geometry.
Yes, I think my attention was paid to the interaction between the building and the surrounding, the environment. This is the part I think very interesting in Pei's design. But in terms of the building itself, and also the space inside, and probably he is more Western, I think.
There was also, just to mention one other thing that was very
The
beautiful
proportion.
in what you said at the end, that Pei's work was more literary
Yes.
than visual.
Yes,
And
so this reminds you of the literature, right? So, and this is a little bit different from even Japanese garden. And the Japanese garden invite you to sit there and meditate. So, and no inscription and allusion. So this is just the object. But in Chinese architecture, you are always encouraged to think about history, think about the literature. So this is, even in Eastern Asia, the two traditions are also different.
Calvin.
I didn't mean to interject, but I think I may have a little bit of insight. I used to watch I Am draw, and with what little knowledge I have of my shared heritage, since I didn't grow up there, I noticed there's something extremely calligraphic, as in Chinese, 一点一画, a stroke, a dot, a plan. And I just see him draw, regardless whether it's a modernist design or a postmodernist or historically or iconographically, semantically motivated work. There's always that underpinning. And as you, Delin, you illustrated that idea of courtyard, both from a early modernist, of interior, exterior, volume, space dialectic, how that sometimes overlap with certain Asian thinking, and the fact that modernism also took its inspiration from the East in the very early moments. So it's very hard to kind of split it to the East-West kind of dialectic.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's one more thing that, Calvin, your comment made me think of, and it goes back to the literary. There is something about Pei's best work that it's, I always think of it, and the Mesa, for me, does this. It's like a divination. You know how I'm thinking of people, what do they call it when you have a stick and you find water? Divining. It's almost like those buildings, the best of them are divining something about the world. And I think part of it for me has to do with an almost totemic quality of some of the forms. In their, I was a little bit criticizing them before, but in their isolation and in their kind of dialogue, but almost like a negative dialogue sometimes with the site. I don't mean negative, I mean like their confidence about being there. There's almost a divination about their being in the world that comes from, I think, a figural quality that Breuer doesn't have, Bunchev certainly doesn't have, and even Kahn kind of. So I think there are, and going back to Delin's comment, I think this literary, or what you call poetic, we'd have to be more precise what we mean by that, but there's something there that is not easily articulable in words, that's much more of a corporeal, but also soulful. It's almost like you want to hook into the universe at its best, right? And I love that a person can do, in an office, can do that, and also do the normal work, the McKimmey and White work, and can have still those dimensions. That just comes back to the discussion last night about the diversity of the office, I think. But we should stop and have a break so that we have plenty of time for the next session. Thank you very much, and thank the panelists.